This is Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Public education has been in the crosshairs for over 30 years from those advocating market-based solutions to education. What has this movement to privatize education wrought among the groups these solutions purport to help? To discuss the state of education and his article published on Truthout called Education Reform in the New Jim Crow Era is P.L. Thomas, an associate professor of education at Furman University in South Carolina. Thanks for being on the program, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
First off, why do you state that the changes in education are essentially a new Jim Crow system?
Well, when I was reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, what immediately struck me was the tremendous parallels between her argument that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow and how the corporate sort of neoliberal approach to education reform has manifested itself in the exact same time period. She basically starts under the Reagan administration, which is exactly in 1983-84 when A Nation at Risk came out under Reagan, and for lack of a better term, the accountability era of education started. And as I read her book, the parallels are really just about impossible to ignore. And so I see the war on drugs and get tough on crime sloganism that has driven mass incarceration is essentially parallel to the no excuses and zero tolerance sloganism that is behind a great deal of sort of the market-based school reform.
Well, it seems like what you're saying then is that the slogans have changed, but the agenda has been the same.
Right, and the mass incarceration and the sort of the bedrocks of the school reform are disproportionately impacting two groups, and it would be minorities and high poverty populations. And just as our prisons are overrepresented by African American males, a great deal of the new educational reform movement, specifically I would target the charter school movement, is affecting African American and high poverty populations. So those parallels are more or less statistics that you cannot argue because they exist. It becomes a little more complicated connecting those statistics with intent, but I don't think it is difficult to match them with results. The consequences, I think, are pretty much undeniable.
Right. The consequences certainly, and it's tough to do one-to-one comparisons at times. So because once you dig into the data, it becomes much more complex, as you highlighted, and sometimes it takes you in different directions. But as you see what's going on, as you highlight what's going on, it is certainly targeting specifically African American groups in urban areas or in poor areas. That's correct, right?
Yes. One of the other works that I mentioned is Sarah Carr's Hope Against Hope, which is just by itself is an outstanding book, and I highly recommend it. But she catalogs after Katrina, the city of New Orleans basically fired the entire public school faculty, and in place of that swept in what I would call corporate charter schools like Kipp, Knowledge is Power program. These are no excuses charter schools that are basically chains, and beside them were sort of Kipp-like charter schools. They weren't necessarily run by Kipp, but they did promote themselves with the no excuses ideology. So these groups, as you mentioned, urban, high poverty, and high minority populations are being targeted by these movements, specifically the charter schools.
For those who don't know, what is this? What are the Kipp schools? What are those?
Kipp schools are basically a chain of charter schools that market what I would say a few features that they have championed but are being replicated in a lot of places. And some of those things are they tend to use Teach for America candidates as their teachers. They tend to promote an extended school day. They tend to require the teachers to pretty much be on call 24 hours a day. They have extreme discipline policies. One of them is the bench, which is a way to make students sit in timeout and essentially be publicly humiliated. They basically are one strike and you're out kind of policies also. The parents and the students generally have to sign an agreement to fulfill the obligations that Kipp asks of both the parents and the students, and if either one of them fails any of those obligations, they're kicked out of the schools. So they have a great deal of attrition, and that's one of the controversies is even when they claim increased test scores, a lot of people point to that the populations of the schools change so much that it's not a fair thing to say that they're succeeding.
Well, you talk a lot about authoritarianism, or at least you highlight authoritarianism in these charter schools, and you certainly did so in that example of the charter schools that you were just talking about. And I was just thinking about when I was back in school, high school, grade school, junior high. It seemed pretty authoritarian back then. I mean, you stepped out of line, you got in trouble, you got sent to the principal's office, maybe you got a referral, you got suspended, and if you were really bad, you got expelled. But I don't remember any kind of public shaming that was going on other than you're going to the principal's office and you kind of leave with your head down and walk down the hall, sort of the walk of shame. But what you've highlighted are some things that have changed. Maybe you could take us through some of the other examples of this increased authoritarianism. I think you highlighted one of them, which was guards in the school.
Right. A few things have happened. I think you're making a really good point. I would emphasize that we have been predisposed to being authoritarian to children historically, which I disagree with. I think it's a really bad decision to think that the only way to help children become self-actualized is to be highly authoritarian and to be very strict with them. So, for example, I risked paddling when I was in school, and that certainly, for the most part, that has disappeared. What is interesting about the new movements, one would be zero tolerance, which you were sort of speaking to there. There's another wonderful book by Kathleen Nolan called Police in the Hallways, and she details the zero tolerance movement that began in the 80s that has culminated with basically metal detectors in schools, but literally we now have urban high schools with police force walking the hallways, but the element that is really kind of stunning is when students do something wrong, they are actually immediately taken into the judicial system. They're not being punished at school. They are literally going directly into the judicial system. And that is a huge step. That's a much different experience than either you or I ever experienced.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It was even rare locally. It was a news story probably 10 or 15 years ago when a high school chose to call the police when high school students would fight on campus. That was seen as a really shocking decision. It is commonplace in some of our urban, high poverty, high minority high schools that students are literally being arrested on campus for things that you and I would have gotten demerits for. So those are some of the sort of extreme examples. The no excuses policies that I was mentioning with Kipp are slightly different, but I would argue they're parallel to them. And a premise of Nolan's Police in the Hallways is that students are internalizing the presence of police and are coming to see themselves as criminals. So the efforts to decriminalize the school is actually having the opposite effect.
Well, you talked about in your piece about the war on drugs, which
Right.
You start with the Reagan administration and their efforts to create a war on drugs that really didn't exist until they created it in a way.
Exactly, yes.
And then you talk about the market-based reforms in education. I see some parallels here in that the war on drugs increased the incarceration rate primarily among African American males, and what you're seeing here is that those schools who have police on campus, which the NRA did recommend as one of their solutions to gun violence within school systems, actually has a similar effect upon students in that it tracks them into the prison industrial complex.
Right. I'm making an argument that there's been a long-standing school-to-prison pipeline set of research or body of research. I want to move beyond that. I think we're having schools as prisons. I think there's a slight shift has taken place. I would also parallel with that the accountability era has created failing schools. It isn't solving the problems of education. So what has happened is, in the same way that police in the hallways have fostered this mindset that we're already criminals in a certain population of students, high poverty schools are being labeled as failures through tests that are more closely associated with the socioeconomic status of the children than the actual ability of the children or the quality of the teachers or ultimately the quality of the school. So all of these are basically, I would say, these are neoliberal dynamics. The war on drugs, you know, the get tough on crime, and then the no excuses and zero tolerance, but then the accountability movement are all sort of neoliberal policies that are creating the problems that they claim to be solving. And I think an interesting way to understand that is Dan Archer and Adam Bessie had graphic journalism in Truthout about disaster capitalism. And the whole idea of disaster capitalism is either create a disaster or swoop in when there is a disaster and proclaim that you're the savior. So the school reform movement is doing two things. It is creating this disaster mentality and then simultaneously claiming to be solving it.
Destroy the village to save it, right?
Exactly, right.
So you talked also, you wrote about this in your piece about teaching to the test, which
right.
My daughter is 17. She's in a public high school here in California. They do a lot of teaching to the test. But one of the things that I've noticed, and it's not necessarily her, but some of her cohorts, is that when you just teach to the test, it does have an effect, and not a very good one. One is that, yes, you get to learn how to take the test, how to pass the test. That's a big metric in rating school performance, but you suffer on the other end, which is there are less creative and critical thinking skills, which I think are very important as students become adults, that as they go out into the world, it's not about just passing a test, but rather how you engage the world and how you think about information that comes down the pipeline, whether through the internet, TV, newspapers, whatever you have at you, and think about information that's coming at you critically, and then also being able to creatively solve problems. And a lot of teaching to the test and this authoritarian structure gets erased.
Right, and I would say probably one of the worst messages that I can give about the school reform movement is that the one thing we're certainly creating are compliant students. And my suspicion is that benefits corporate America, because corporate America benefits from compliant workers. So there's a real serious problem if we are claiming universal public education as a foundation of democracy. We would be behaving dramatically different. We would be encouraging creativity. We would be encouraging students making decisions for themselves. And I teach at an elite private university. It's a selective university, and our students are very, very bright. They're wonderful young students, and I teach first-year seminars. I teach writing in first-year seminars, and they're almost universally completely incapable of making decisions for themselves about their own writing. And it is certainly not from their lack of intelligence. It's their lack of experience with those sort of opportunities. And it takes us much of the semester to get them comfortable with making decisions, risking failure, and the system has them so petrified of making mistakes and not doing as they're told. It's really disturbing. It's really disturbing. And these are the so-called top students. you can only imagine the impact it's having on the broad spectrum of students. So I would argue that yes, the teaching to the test is a real serious problem. It's deprofessionalizing teachers. It's making teachers teaching a service industry. They're simply doing as they're told, and then they're passed that down to the students, and now the students are simply doing as they are told. And in the end, it's just sort of a corrupt contribution to a sort of Walmarting of the corporate world where they just want compliant workers and just want part-time workers. And I've always said, sadly, the adults running schools and the adults running businesses rarely want people who think for themselves.
Unfortunately, that's the case, and I think that one of the things, and you just talked about this earlier, was, I guess sociologists would call it secondary socialization, where we learn from our higher institutions or our institutions like schools on certain things that we take into our adulthood and into our lives later. And schools are a real powerful secondary socializing agent. And if you have a school that that encourages critical thinking, encourages discussion, problem solving, creative thinking, rather than compliance, authoritarianism, obedience to authority, that sort of thing. One, you have individuals that go out into the society and can solve problems, and then the other, you have individuals that go out into society and are just essentially worker bees. And when I was going to school, yes, it was kind of authoritarian, and we were talking about that as well, that there was always that overarching sense of, well, you eventually have to defer to authority, whether it's the principal or to the teacher. But my teachers, my schools, they were also encouraging us to participate in society. There were more clubs for free thinking about problem solving. Even if you wanted to go into journalism, about criticizing the school, the school administration. But as you're seeing, you're at an elite university and you're seeing students that are coming in and that are not prepared for that are not prepared for leadership roles. And it doesn't have to be like leadership roles in an elite society. It could be the leadership role of your pool club or something like that. And problem solving. If that goes away, then we're changing as a country, definitely.
Right, and I would say that there's, historically, one of the mistakes of universal public education has been it too often has been a sorting mechanism. And Lisa Delpit uses the term other people's children. And what we see happening now is the children and even the people who are running the corporate reform movement are all in school settings or went to school settings completely unlike the reform they're recommending. So in the past, when you went to school, when I went to school, there was some in-school sorting where some of us got to take a stronger track than others, which I think is wrong, but that sorting did happen. Now you're seeing it happen school-wide. In other words, there are entire schools that are treating other people's children in a way that none of these leaders would allow their own children to be treated. And, they tend to go to elite private schools where their children are not taking high-stakes testing, and they're not being taught to the test, and they're not having scripted lessons, and they're in small classrooms, and they don't have police in the hallways. So the sorting mechanism that was a flaw of the traditional school system up through the 1980s has been replaced by a much larger sorting system now that is, entire schools, where we also have the charter schools that are almost 100% white and almost 100% affluent. And of course, those look nothing like the Kipp schools.
Right. There no sitting in benches there and no police in the hallway. Right. I know the Kipp schools didn't have police in the hallway, but you did highlight some that did. Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much.
Read P.L. Thomas's piece on Truthout, share it with your social networks, and remember to subscribe to this channel. I try to get these videos out every week or every other week, and that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thanks for watching.